tricky skill that we need to work on, because sometimes people will say things and we don't really hear what they meant. We hear what we want to hear. And we know that a lot of folks do that because we are predisposed by our own life experiences or things that have happened to us to hear not what was meant or said, but what we think was meant or said. As I contemplated Jesus' words, "You have heard that I say unto you," I remember as a child sometimes my mother would say something to me and I wouldn't respond. And she would repeat it, and I still wouldn't respond. And I remember her saying, "What's wrong with you? Can't you hear me? We need to get the wax out of your ears." Some of you may have heard that over your lifetimes. We need to get the wax out of our ears. I think sometimes when we read these words of Jesus, they seem very, very harsh. And I've always been intrigued by what is it that Jesus is trying to say to those who are hearing his words. The first thing he acknowledges is that they're very well acquainted with the law. They know all the things that he is saying because he says, "You have heard." He knows they are aware of the guidelines that God has set for human encounters. But then he does something else. He says, "But I say unto you." What in the world could Jesus have been trying to say? Because what he does when he says, "But I say unto you," he makes it sound so weighty and so heavy and so unattainable that many of us would simply shrug our shoulders and say, "What's the point of it all?" Or "What's the use in trying?" Because somehow I don't think I can ever live up to this. I mean, there's not a person in here today who hasn't been angry at a brother or a sister at one point or another. And sometimes have said words we wish we could take back, but once they're out, and there's no taking back. And Jesus says that we should be very careful with how we speak with and to one another. He couches that in the Old Testament admonition that thou shalt not kill. And it's almost as if he equates anger with killing someone. So why is Jesus making these kinds of statements to this crowd that has gathered to hear? I mean, he's just said to them the Beatitudes, "Blessed are those," and I'm sure that they found great comfort in that because many of them could say, "Well, that's me, I've done that. I've practiced that." And so there was a sense of comfort. But sometimes when we get comfortable, we get lazy. It's a human trait. When everything's going right and everything just seems so fine and dandy, sometimes we forget that we're still on the journey and we still have to put forth our best effort. Whatever the day brings, we need to put forth our best effort. Whether it's where we work, or whether we recreate, whatever we're doing. Sometimes when we forget that we need to be at our best, we simply somehow lag behind. These words that Jesus says, "But I say unto you," are words that remind us that being a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ always requires our best. Think about that for a moment. It's not just enough to be an observer of the law. That's why Paul wrote his letters to Corinth and the churches to whom he wrote. It's not just enough to observe the legalities of every day. What in addition does God require of us? I'm sure that when Jesus spoke these words, he was also thinking maybe of the Old Testament, where the Mishnah is kept, and where the prophet Micah finally wrote, "What does the Lord require of you? But to love kindness, to do justice, and to walk humbly with your God." Now, sometimes that's a major challenge for us as the events of the day unfold, because we are predisposed to behave in certain ways depending on what's going on with us. Sometimes I'm not having a good day, and so if somebody says the wrong thing to me, I'm short with them. Have you ever had that experience? I'll bet you have, haven't you? And the minute you do that, you feel like, why did I do that? I mean, that's not what was required in terms of my response. but that's the way human beings often act. So Jesus, when he said these words, you have heard that it was said, but I say unto you, he's really talking about, it's almost hyperbole. That is, he's overstating the case to make us aware that being a disciple is not always an easy thing to be. We're challenged almost every day in our spiritual journeys by circumstances and events as days unfold. Sometimes it's by the people we work with, sometimes it's by the community in which we live, sometimes it's even in our own family settings. How do we exist in those places? Simply by observing the mandatory requirements? Or is it that God asks us to be sensitive and caring beyond what the world is? I mean, Paul wrote this letter to Corinth because there were people in the church who were still arguing about who was it that led me to Jesus Christ. You know, for a long time I was a superintendent, 7.5 years. And on one of those days, I talked about how the Apostle Paul came to know Jesus Christ. And I'm one of those who believes that Paul studied at the temple in Jerusalem with the Pharisees, and he must have heard the Pharisees talking about Jesus. Or he may even have heard Jesus himself, because Paul was about 16 at that time. And I was responsible for the devotions for the cabinet on that particular morning. And my goal was to ask people to think about who planted the seed in your spiritual journey. Afterwards, one of my colleagues said, well, we didn't want a lecture this morning. And I said, why did you think it was a lecture? I was asking you to look within yourself to see how is it that you came to know Jesus Christ? And how is it that you continue to grow in your relationship with your Savior? He thought that I was trying to make some kind of a case for whatever. But what I really wanted to know was, how is it that we are God's people? How is it that we belong to Jesus Christ? And I think that's the very thing that Paul was talking about when he wrote this letter to the church at Corinth. You can be divided by all kinds of things in any community, any organization. But the one thing that will hold us together and the one thing that will keep us focused is our relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, I always have trouble with, you have heard that it was said, but I say unto you. Because some of the things that Jesus says to the crowd who are gathered there are almost impossible to embrace. Life isn't that way for most of us. We go through life with our peaks and our valleys, our successes and our failures. And in the midst of all of that, if we were to take Jesus seriously when he talked about this, we would say, well, we're already in hell. Because all of us have been unreasonably angry at one time or another with someone. Is that what Jesus really meant? Or was it just raising the bar to help us understand how significant relationships are as we go through our days? And how precious each person is we may meet along the way. And how we treat that person is a reflection of the love of God at work in us or not. And I think that Jesus was trying to convey that to the people who were listening to him. I know that there are some folks who believe you should take the scripture literally. And I'm always tempted. Instead of looking for the deeper meaning, what did Jesus say? Well, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. Better lose an eye than to go to hell. Or if your hand offends you, cut it off. Better to lose a hand than to go to hell. And yet, I never find those folks who want to take the scripture literally without eyes and hands. So what is it that Jesus is talking about here? He's talking about the deeper kind of living that comes from a relationship with Jesus Christ. He's not expecting us to pluck out our eyes or cut off our hands. That's not what he's after. He's after our deeper understanding of what it means to be a believer in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And so he uses these, you have heard that it was said, but I say unto you, to deepen us down a little bit, to help us to step back and to think about the interpersonal relationships of our lives, and whether we are building relationships or tearing them down, whether we are encouraging people or discouraging people, whether we are offering a helping hand or a boot, if you will. This is really what Jesus is trying to say to this crowd. It's an eternal message, friends. It's a message for each of us as we contemplate how our days unfold. Because we have the capacity to do wonderful things in the name of Jesus Christ. We truly do. You never know when a word you speak will make all of the difference for someone. Conversely, you never know how a harsh or hard word will disintegrate a person before your very eyes. So think about what he's really trying to say to us. You have heard. Well, maybe to hear the deeper message that Jesus is trying to say, we need to get the wax out of our ears. Don't just hear the surface comment. Hear the deeper purpose for which he says this to his people and to us. Because it's a deepening of our relationship with God and with one another. It needs to be caring. It needs to be uplifting. It needs to be encouraging. And since we're not perfect, maybe sometimes we need to look at the worst expression of what happens when we aren't caring and uplifting to understand what a difference it makes in our families, in our communities, the places we work, and the places we recreate. Wherever you go today, don't get so worried about plucking out your eye or cutting off your hand, but simply be aware that here's an opportunity as you interface with people day in and day out to see what possibilities God has in store for us. You have heard. Have you? Have you really heard? Jesus says, deepen down. Don't just go with the flow. Deepen down. Understand how significant it is to treat one another with love, respect, and care. Now, I could do a Bible study on this morning, and maybe I already have. But I want us to really begin to think about how it is we live and move and have our being each and every day. And I think that's what Jesus was saying when he said, you have heard. Have you really heard? It's not a matter of just fulfilling the minimal expectations. Christians are people who always deepen down. Have you heard?